This is chapter 10, beginning of evolution and natural selection. So we're going to start off talking about evolution in general, so how we can see evolution occur, and then we're going to lead into what evolution and natural selection are, the mechanisms for it, and then the evidence for it. So we're going to start off this chapter with a question. Now, evolution is an ongoing process. This is something we can see all the time around us. This is the glasswing butterfly, and it's found in Peru. And you can see here that the wings are see-through for the most part. It does have this eye and this red patch, and that is actually a camouflage. This eye actually makes it look like a different organism when it's hiding, say, in a tree. So let's see what I mean by evolution, is an ongoing process, that we can see it happening all the time around us. So what we're going to look at is an experiment that is described in the textbook using fruit flies. So these are the little flies. You've probably never looked at one up close like this before. But these are the little guys that are buzzing around like your bananas and things like that. Now, fruit flies can reproduce pretty fast, and they actually have an average lifespan of, if you take their food away, of about 20 hours. So what you're looking at here with this graph is if we take the food away from a group of fruit flies, so they have no food source, after about 5 hours, you're going to start seeing some of the fruit flies die. But on average, most of the fruit flies will make it 20 hours before they starve to death. And then some of the fruit flies will make it in this population to about 35 hours before the whole population has died. So, question is, could you breed fruit flies that could live longer than 20 hours on average? And obviously, if I'm asking this question, the answer would be yes. We actually can, but then the question would be, how? How could you breed fruit flies that live longer than 20 hours on average? So go ahead and take a second, think about that, put your answer in the question that comes up on how you may, and it doesn't have to be correct, but how you think you could design an experiment to get fruit flies to last longer than 20 hours when you take their food away. All right, so let's take a look at the experiment that was designed to test this. So my guess is that some of you may have come up with this, or if you read the book, you probably were like, oh, I know how to do this. So here's the experiment. So got a group of fruit flies flying around in a tank, and you take their food away. So you can see that the initial experiment that was run with this had 5,000 fruit flies. So what you do is they took their food away. You can see up here, obviously there's not 5,000 fruit flies in there. Each of the green little guys equals 500 fruit flies. So they keep the food out until 80% of the fruit flies have starved, all right? Until you have a majority of the fruit flies dead at the bottom of the cage. And so that means if each of these guys is 500, you've got 1,000 fruit flies still alive. That means that these ones have that starvation resistance. So then you give their food back when you get to this point, and allow them to reproduce and lay eggs, and then take these eggs and hatch them out and test them to see what their starvation resistance is. So map out that curve just like we did for this original population. All right. So when these eggs hatch, do you think the flies in the new generation that came from that 1,000 fruit flies that got starved will live longer than 20 hours without food. So you'll see in the question, you got three options: less than, the same 20 hours, or more than. All right, so here's the original population of flies. So with the average starvation resistance of 20 hours. And remember, this is the population that the researchers allowed 80% of them to die, so that we had the ones that should be able to survive longer. And here are the results of the experiment. So this is their offspring. So the first generation. And as you can see, the average did move. So they actually did increase the starvation resistance. So the first population could last 20 hours without food. The second generation were able to last on average 23 hours without food. So it shifted the curve just that little bit. So we have flies now that can last almost that full day without any food. So do you think that they stopped there? Of course not. We don't stop just with that one step with the experiments like this. So what they did is they kept doing the experiment. So they took generation 1, did the same thing, starved them until 80% of the fruit flies passed away, then gave them the food back, let them breed, raise their offspring, and did this over and over and over again. They did this for 160 generations to see what would happen. And what happened is this. So remember, originally average starvation was average starvation resistance was 20 hours. After 60 generations, I got the numbers mixed up. After 60 generations, they were able to last 160 hours. So the average starvation resistance for this 60th generation was 160 hours. That is almost an entire week without food. And for something small like a fruit fly, that is huge. I don't know about you. I don't want these fruit flies in my house because, you know, I rely on the fact that the bananas being out of the house for a couple of days makes the fruit flies go away. But this shows us that something was changing, right? And so what was changing? Yeah, right? The genetics were changing. The information in the fruit flies were changing over time, right? So this original population didn't have the same information in their DNA as this last 60th generation. So what happened? Evolution, right? What is evolution? Evolution is just a genetic change in the population. Population is a group of the same species. So in this case, we had a genetic change in the group of the fruit flies, right? Their genes, their DNA, their genetic information changed in that population from the first generation to the 60th generation. In fact, that evolution, that change happened between the first generation, generation 0, and their offspring, as we went from 20 hours to 23 hours. So then how did that happen? Well, in this case, it's due to certain individuals in the population being born with a characteristic that makes them more likely to survive. Basically, some of those fruit flies had the ability to survive without food better, right? They didn't die, and they were able to reproduce, pass that information to their offspring, and make that genetic change happen. What is that called? That is called natural selection. So natural selection is one way that we can get this genetic change. So natural selection is this right here, that certain individuals have characteristics that make them more likely to survive and reproduce, right? The thing is that we'll see later in this chapter, That's not the only way that evolution can happen. There are multiple ways that evolution, this genetic change, can occur over time. Right? So, does evolution occur? Yes. We can watch it in the lab whenever we want. It's easy to do with things like fruit flies and bacteria because they reproduce quickly. It's harder to see with larger organisms because they take longer to reproduce. Right? So it's harder to see with something like a horse because it takes, a year or more to get, a baby horse, and then that baby horse has to grow up and reproduce, right? Fruit flies, they reproduce within a couple of weeks, and so we can get those new fruit flies very quickly. So where are we headed? So as far as evolution, we're going to be talking about who came up with the idea of evolution. You probably know his name. Then we're going to talk about what types of changes can evolution cause in a population, and how we can get evolution. So those different methods. So natural selection we'll talk more about, but some other mechanisms for that. And then we'll finish up this chapter with the 5 primary lines of evidence that support the theory of evolution.